Welcome to the Orthocast. Today we have Father Deacon Ananias. He is a convert to the Orthodox faith from Lutheranism. He is a current deacon in the Orthodox Church. He is CEO of Patristic Faith, an amazing website with articles from lots of the top Orthodox creators, including Jay Dyer, David Erhan, Abbot Trifon. Definitely go check out the website. He also has a YouTube channel with amazing lectures, lots of great collabs. He even hosts a conference every year in Montana called Montanica. It's during the summer. You should go visit. It's been growing every year. And he also teaches philosophy at the college level. So he's a very busy guy. So thanks so much for joining us. Your streams really helped me a lot, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here finally. We get to do a stream together. So God bless you and thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it really is an honor, and hopefully the first of many streams. So my first question for you is, what was your upbringing like? You were raised Lutheran. Did you ever fall away from the faith? What was your ideas of Christianity?
Yeah. So I was born in Minnesota, and so as a lot of people know about Minnesota, they're German, Norwegian, Scandinavian people who a lot of them are Lutherans. So my family came out of Lutheranism, and we moved to California when I was about 4 years old and spent most of my time there. I did, my grandparents, who were very close to me on my mother's side and we lived with for a while, were Church of Christ. They're a Restorationalist church. Joseph Campbell, believe, is the founder of that. Spent some time in that is my when I was young, and my mother broke away from that and then started taking me to Calvary Chapel. If you're familiar with that, you have the Jesus Revolution movie that just came out with Greg Laurie and Chuck Smith. So I grew up primarily in that kind of non-denominational evangelical. I went to junior high and high school at Calvary Chapel. Pushed away from that. It didn't. There was things even in high school that rubbed me the wrong way, and so soon after that, I came back to my Lutheran roots, and even went through a formal catechesis program with my wife, who I was dating at the time, and we were pretty active members of the Lutheran Church. I did occasionally go to a high church Anglican, so I just started, unfortunately, mixing like a smorgasbord. Well, I'm a Anglo-Lutheran, high liturgical, right? Like I'm just building this system.
Yeah.
And that was kind of, right. That's right before I converted.
Yeah. So
like as a summary of where I've been at.
Yeah.
And I never fell away from the Christian faith.
Yeah. So how did you find out about Orthodoxy, and was it a pretty fast transition once you did find out about it?
14 years from when
Wow.
I was introduced to.
Wow.
Okay. And by the way, I checked out Roman Catholicism. I went to the most Roman Catholic college in the universe. It's called Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California. They have a campus in Massachusetts now. It's a great books, classic liberal arts college. And I studied there. Now, I bring that up because that's when I was first introduced to Orthodoxy.
Oh.
In fact, before then, I should say, before I went to Thomas Aquinas College, after graduating high school, when I was my senior years of high school, I was introduced to philosophy and Christian apologetics. We had an individual that would come in every Friday to our Bible class and teach logic, Christian apologetics, and philosophy, and it blew me away. I was just like, yes. He put me in contact with two local groups. One was created by Russ Mannion. And think about this was back in 1995, 96.
Wow.
And so I've known Russ Mannion and a lot of these kind of Christian apologetics groups since then. And I bring that up because at the Russ Mania's group, it was called Dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
There was an Orthodox priest, Father
Oh.
Paul. And Father Paul, I mean, I vaguely kind of knew he was, but Father Paul would come up to Thomas Aquinas College because there were several Orthodox students there. So he would hear their confessions, he would check in on them. And I was in exploratory mode at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe, I know this is going to date me, but that was 1999. 2000 was the first time that I went to an Orthodox liturgy.
Wow.
And it immediately came in my mind that if I were ever to convert, and I told the Roman Catholics this, it would be to Orthodoxy. But the thing is, I had broken my back skiing when I was 18, and I was having a lot of back problems. And that 2 hour, I never experienced a 2 hour church service.
Yeah.
And it was standing too. And I was like, this is beautiful. And I just don't think I can stand here
Yeah.
for, um, also, I had some unfortunate kind of preconceptions. I already thought, especially you have to understand as a Lutheran,
Mm-hmm.
Lutherans and maybe a lot of Protestants are very skeptical of mysticism,
Mm-hmm.
miracles. It's very rational.
Yeah.
It's very cold. And we'd always have these jokes in the Lutheran church that, well, when a non-Lutheran comes in, because when they go to, the kiss of peace or they go to shake the hand, they step across the aisle, and all the Lutherans are, oh, are like, that's just too much for a Lutheran.
Yeah.
You can't, keep it in line, keep it ordered, cold. And you really have that kind of, I think, in the German, Scandinavian,
Mm-hmm.
is just a real kind of stoic, cold
Yeah.
kind of culture. And so put that into kind of Protestantism too. It saw, you're protesting against the Roman Catholic Church, and what you saw is kind of superstitions and weird traditions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So they were very skeptical of that. I already thought that the Roman Catholics were totally insane when it came to like superstition.
Mm-hmm.
They would find that they would put icon cards under my pillow.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is weird. Like, what a weird superstition. Then I went and saw the Orthodox, and I'm like, oh, they're on a whole nother level. Because the first liturgy I went to, they were actually talking about, the parishioners had just saw the myrrh streaming icon of Avalon. And they had like the myrrh, and it was all a bunch of babushkas because it was a Russian church.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh my God, I see the myrrh, and they were crying. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
I thought it was, God forgive me, I thought it was crazy.
Yeah.
And I know that rubbed me the wrong way. I was too intellectual, and this will tie into the other questions you have later.
Yeah.
Too kind of scholastic, and that prevented me from becoming Orthodox for 14 years.
Yeah.
That you can't enter in, and I'm telling the audience this, you cannot enter into Orthodoxy through abstract facts and books. It's a life, and it requires a certain level of humility too. And it took me 14 years to get to that point, because unfortunately, my own obstacles, as we always say, that there's a quote by Saint Nikolai Velaramovic, that you realize that the wars between myself and me as God wants, is I want to be, and me as God wants me to be.
Yeah.
And isn't that the truth?
Yeah. Totally.
And so it's my fault. It's my own stupid stubbornness and pride that took me 14 years to get into Orthodoxy.
Wow. And so during that time where you were still going kind of the Lutheran, Anglican, you wanted something more sacramental and like a high church. and you saw that in Orthodoxy, but then you still had the overly rational. And especially back then, there was not the amount of resources that there is today. A lot of the books hadn't been translated yet, so you couldn't. But you saw there was something like good and true in it. So when over those like 14 years, when did like the cards start to tumble and you like Orthodoxy, started to make more sense? Was there any like pivotal moments, or was it just like time and yeah?
Well, first of all, I came back to Lutheranism primarily because I wasn't ready to come into Orthodoxy. Like I said, it seemed too mystical.
Yeah.
I had made my mind after reading all those books behind you, the Church Fathers set, that, and arguing with the best kind of Thomistic professors and philosophers, that I was like, there's no way I'm going to ever become Roman Catholic. I'd made up my mind at Thomas Aquinas College. I'm like, absolutely, there's no way.
Wow.
So, but what I did get an appreciation, and I changed while I was an undergraduate, from reading the Fathers, was a sense of authority. Now, obviously, I didn't get to the level of normative authority and real presence.
Yeah.
I switched my mind and understood. I'm like, no, there's the real presence of the Eucharist. So where was I to go if I wasn't going to go to Roman Catholicism for sure, and I wasn't ready to come into Orthodoxy? It seemed right at the time in my mind to go back to my Lutheran roots, who believed in some semblance of authority.
Yeah.
And also the real presence. I'd say that was a seed that was ultimately going to change me. Then when I went to Ireland for my grad work, in 2004 to 2005 is when I did my master's. And then 2005 to 2011 was my PhD. One of the places that I lived, I think it was my first year on my PhD program, I lived right across the street from the Romanian embassy. And then it must have put something in my mind, but I actually started looking for an Orthodox church while I was in Ireland, because I got kicked out of the Lutheran church for getting in an argument with them over women's ordination. And I said something like, and LGBT stuff. And I basically accused, because they were actually German. They were all German speaking. It was like and I accused them of not learning anything from the last bad episode that the Germans had.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you guys, and they got really upset with me. You don't ever bring up that episode with a German, like those bad years.
Yeah.
Because they really want to forget it and don't want to be reminded. I'm like, you're just the same. You're embracing the spirit of the time and the culture. And it was really upsetting to me. And they basically told me I wasn't no longer welcome there. So I was like, whatever.
Wow.
And I started looking for an Orthodox church, and I found a Romanian Orthodox church right by where I lived. And I didn't understand at the time that you could go to liturgy and the liturgy wouldn't have to be in English. But I called up the priest and I said, do you have any services in English? And he said, no. And so I was like, oh. And I put it off, unfortunately. Now, all this is hilarious because do you know what church jurisdiction I got ordained in?
Romanian. Yeah.
Romanian Orthodox.
Yeah.
In a super ethnic parish I worked in, is a deacon for 4 years. I'd went there before I was a deacon too. But I'm telling you, as ethnic Romanian as you could get. They didn't speak any English, and I had to learn Romanian and do liturgy in Romanian. So God has a wonderful sense of humor, and it's just kind of funny how all that stuff literally put me in front of the Romanian embassy and Romanian church. That's really nice. But I'll tell you what changed in me. I've been married to my wife for 16 years. We've been known each other for 19, 20 years, because we dated about 3 years before we got married. We went to the same high school together. She had a spinal cord injury in high school that never got dealt with properly. And so when we got married, she had finished law school. And when we got married, she was working at a law firm, and she rapidly declined and became permanently and totally disabled.
Wow.
And the pain was just excruciating. She did then develop epilepsy. The doctors then destroyed her ovaries because she had something happen into her internal organs. And my life just totally collapsed while I was trying to do a PhD. And I just can't tell you how miserable it became. And we were talking the other day, and she was saying nobody will understand how excruciating that pain was. Most people would kill themselves with this disease because they just couldn't stand to go through the pain. And I had to deal with that, and the depression. I was isolated. I didn't have a church. I didn't have a community. I didn't have family. I couldn't really relate to anybody in my grad program because they're all liberal atheists. And it's a miracle that it broke me. It absolutely broke me. And thank God, because that's ultimately what led me into the Orthodox Church. Because when I came back to California, I had some friends that I grew up with, and her husband had been in some of these philosophy groups growing up with me, but we really hadn't actually met each other. So we finally got a chance to meet each other face to face. And he says, I didn't know this, but he was studying Orthodoxy. And so he says, what do you think about sola scriptura? And I'm like, oh, it's garbage. And he couldn't believe I said that as a Protestant, but I was way past that. I was like, oh yeah, you have an authority, like a book be a single authority, and you need an authoritative body. And he was just like, I've never heard a Protestant ever say that. So he invited me to liturgy. Oh. And at the same time, I had a friend of mine that when I was younger at Church of Christ, he kept telling me when I was in Ireland that he was interested in Orthodoxy. Wow. And he was going to liturgy. And I told him, oh, yeah, you got to stay away from them. They're too mystical and superstitious. And so anyways, when I get back to California, I'm invited to liturgy. And by my, one of my best friend's husband.
Yeah.
And my other friend that I grew up with in the Church of Christ was there.
Wow. Small world.
Now, this whole conversation stirred my interest in Orthodoxy again, so I started doing a lot more research. I became particularly fascinated by incorruptibles.
Yeah.
And comparing them with the quote-unquote incorruptibles of the Roman Catholic Church, because my wife and I had been to the Vatican in Rome. And I remember it was just so bizarre because I'm like, why do they look so weird? They look like wax figurines.
Yeah.
And I later come to find out they actually encase them in wax. And I'm like, well, now nobody knows if they're incorruptible or not because they've been treated, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know about this, but
no, I've heard of that. They have like specific masks and stuff too that they put on, versus in Orthodoxy they don't do that. It's just if they're incorruptible, they're incorruptible, and then there's like merch streaming.
I'll try to conclude the story because this is really what. But my wife was becoming worried about me that I was like she thought I was getting morbid. I was like, sweetheart, look at this. This guy's like 400 years old and he doesn't like, because I was super into science at the time. Like everything was like science. And as we'll talk later, I was into theistic evolution and I really put all my eggs in the science basket. And it just was a contradiction to my paradigm because I was like, that doesn't make sense. How does this?
Yeah.
And I told her I was going to go to, I started reading more of the fathers about Orthodoxy, and, she's still permanently disabled in bed, and so she couldn't go. And I said, well, I'm going to go check this out. And she says, I don't want you converting to Orthodoxy. I'm tired of you building these systems, jumping around religions, which was totally me, right? Because at that time, I'm like, okay, I'm Anglo-Lutheran, but I don't have this aspect. And if I'll just take a little bit of this here and add this.
Yeah.
And I started building this whole system. And I already started to kind of feel like there's no way this is what's required for salvation.
Yeah.
Like, this is so complicated. Like, who could actually figure this out is kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And I said to her, I'm like, hey, take it easy. Nobody's converting. I'm just going to go check it out. And again, I get there. I see my two friends. And the first thing I see when I walk in was the very person that I was actually fascinated with, and that was St. John Maximovich.
Yeah.
There was an icon, and I was like, well, that's kind of weird. I'm like, that's the exact incorruptible.
Yeah.
And then I had an indescribable miracle and noetic experience in that liturgy.
Wow.
In which, because keep in mind, I was in the deepest despair,
Yeah.
barely hanging on. I couldn't make sense of why God had allowed us to have everything taken from us, and my wife, and the pain. It just didn't make sense to me. And I was wrestling through that, and nobody had any answers. I remember in Ireland, I broke down and I went I burst into the philosophy department crying. And I was like, I want to end my life. I'm like, there's no hope. And isn't it funny that none of those smart philosophers had a single thing to say? Wow. What are they going to? And I'm like, and that's also an important point that I'm bringing up, that it's useless. All that philosophy and all those systems are completely useless because they can't reach a man in the deepest pain. And if something and somebody can't reach a person in the deepest, darkest sorrow and pain, it's useless. I'm sorry. And so I started. Do you notice that the whole system's starting to break apart?
Yeah.
The idol that I constructed. And so I had a noetic experience in the liturgy in which I noetically was able to perceive all the events that happened in my life that I thought were random, people that I met, that they were all being orchestrated without overriding my free will. And I can only describe this in kind of poetic language. It didn't even come visually, too, because it's noetic. It's like it was obviously my nous. But I have to use kind of visual language and kind of metaphorical language to describe this. But it was like a dance, like God was dancing with me.
Yeah.
I chose something, chose friends. I was here at this place and did this and went to that school. And God matched that.
Yeah.
While at the same time guiding me to a goal. And the last kind of vision was that everything was orchestrated. All the pain, the suffering, the friends that I met, everything that happened. All the stuff with the religious stuff, the schooling, to walk through those doors of that liturgy. It's like God was saying, your whole life has been waiting for this day. Wow. And it was completely overwhelming. It just, I couldn't even make sense. I felt like I was hit over the back of the head or something, and I was like, oh my gosh, what happened to me? And so I had to actually grab some people after liturgy, and I'm like, something happened in the liturgy. Oh my. And I had to tell them what was going on in my life with my wife, and I was like, I don't know how to begin to explain what's. I'm like, I wish this didn't happen, because now I've got to go. Remember what the last words out of my wife's mouth was, like, we're not converting. I'm like, I just had the most incredible experience of life. I've got to go back. I'm like, do I hide it and be like, oh yeah, nothing happened? Don't. I was like, I don't know what to say, and I was like, actually, I need to go home and be like, she's gonna know something happened to me.
Yeah.
Wives know, and so I had to talk to people and consult. I'm like, what am I gonna do? Here's what's going on with my wife and our lives. We don't have anything. We don't have any money. The only reason why I had a place to live is because I was being a caretaker for my grandmother. And they just said, don't tell her anything, just love her. So when I went back home, she did know. She immediately saw it on my face, like, what the heck? And I was like, she's like, what happened to you? And I'm like, what do you mean? What happened to me?
Oh my.
And I'm like, look, I'm a philosopher. I've been trained my whole life to be able to put the loftiest ideas into words. And I'm like, I'm dumb. I'm like, I don't even know. But that energy, the from the experience, I took it with me, and it was contagious. It actually flowed into, to my wife.
Yeah.
And she started like crying, and I started crying. Like I'm already getting emotional just having a memory of and talking about this.
Yeah.
And she hugged me, and she said, I want to convert. I want to come home. And she didn't know. I'm like, where did she hear this phrase, I want to come home? Because if you notice, it was actually a common phrase to come home to the faith of Peter and Paul, of the apostles, right?
Wow.
And I still hadn't made up my mind. I was so bewildered that it wasn't until she basically said that I was like, we had a series of just continual miracles. For St. John's myrrh oil turning into myrrh. Yeah. Eventually, I mean, there's so many miracles that started happening. It was like so fast because I'd given up.
Yeah. So
the only impediment to God's grace in my life was myself, as I mentioned with Saint Nikolai Velimirovic. That I was my worst enemy in my whole life.
Yeah.
I'm the obstacle. But when you're absolutely broken, when your whole systems that you built don't mean anything anymore, when everything that you hoped in, there's no hope anymore, it's an amazing place to be. Yeah. Like there's no more obstacles and resistance to God's grace. So it was like really fast what started happening, all the miracles in our lives. And just seeing God. And so that was, notice, it wasn't contradicting everything I studied. It put all the things that I studied in the right place.
Yeah.
Now I had the paradigmatic lenses, the paradigm lenses, to see everything correctly. Why? Because like we say with the Jesus prayer, right? I silenced everything was taken out of my mind. All the things that I thought were true, all the things that I hoped in, all the systems were just broken down, and it's like now I can see. Wow. There's nothing blocking it anymore, and so it was through the kind of pain and suffering, together with everything that I learned, that brought me into the Orthodox Church. And it was a long story, but it's an important story.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing story, and so personal, and everyone. Yeah, you get to a place and there's nowhere left to go, and you're forced to see it through a new lens because you can't continue down this path. That was an amazing story. That's really great. Thank you. Part of that too, so like this time you were writing your PhD dissertation, theistic.
Yeah, so
that was back. Yeah,
just the timeline. I finished my PhD. I submitted in December 2011. Yeah. And we moved back right after I was granted I did my Viva Voce defense and defended it and passed. And then, I moved back. So basically, we were back in the United States, and I hadn't been back in the United States, living there for 7 years. 2012, and then I believe we came into the church 2013.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. And so originally, you wanted to write your dissertation on theistic evolution because you were getting a lot of like Jesuit influence and some like Catholic influence, but then. And you were trying to like make it work because you were in the wrong paradigm. You're trying to think about these things in a certain way. So when was it that you realized, because this is a tough problem for a lot of people. It was an interesting problem for me, like coming from an atheistic background, I never even had really actually heard the arguments for it, and it was part of like seeing my worldview shattered, and like I had my own like experiences, but then like looking to other worldviews, seeing there's nowhere to go in the atheistic Darwinist worldview, and I started to look more into the arguments. So like, what was it for you that was kind of the catalyst?
Orthodox. I mean,
Yeah.
I brought this stuff into Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to kind of give you a little bit of background.
Yeah.
Obviously, I went to Thomas Aquinas College.
Mm-hmm.
I was an Aristotelian Thomistic philosopher. I definitely identified as that.
Yeah.
Then I went to grad school. Wonderful professor and man, despite the fact that he was a Jesuit priest.
Mm-hmm.
He might have been one of the only good Jesuit priests in a sense.
Yeah.
But he was definitely influenced by the Jesuit mindset,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of a more progressive. Well, he was very conservative, but I mean progressive in the kind of.
Yeah.
The fact is, he taught me about Bernard Lonergan, who was a neo-Thomist. Introduced me to Cardinal Schönborn, and was getting me into the theistic evolution. And I always liked science. I have a double minor in math and science from undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
My PhD was in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. And so I thought this was great. I thought I could bring all these things together. Where it's like, oh, sweet, Thomism, science, probability theory, and all this stuff, and I'll just make this huge concoction and call it my PhD dissertation. And I'll offer a solution to the mind-body problem through all this stuff. And when I came into Orthodoxy, I brought that. And not only that, I was also trained by, again, another wonderful professor. He's a Roman Catholic, but he was an anarcho-capitalist. Always on the Tom's Woods show and stuff like that. And he would actually have me teach as a grad student, his logic modules, and he had this class called Anarchy, Law, and the State. Mm-hmm. And going into grad school, I was already kind of little libertarian leaning.
Yeah.
And he basically started laughing at me about being a libertarian. He was like, no, I'm going to tell you and teach you about anarchy. Like no state at all.
Yeah.
And I bought it. I was just like, and I brought that into Orthodoxy too. So it was like, oh, no, really. The fathers, they're all evolutionists, you see, and they're all anarcho-libertarian and believe in that, right?
Yeah.
And I just have to cherry pick and build my whole case.
Yeah.
So rather than being kind of immersed in the phronema of the church and the fathers, what did I do? I came in with some definite ideas of course, if I believe the fathers are right. Mm-hmm. And obviously they must agree with me because my position is right. You see how this works? So all I have to do is convince the rest of the Orthodox world that the fathers actually agree with me. And how do you do that? Well, you just cherry pick, just like a Protestant. See, this is very Protestant. I call it modus protestandi. That I'll just build my case. I already come in with a thesis, right? That's mine, that I built on my own, and I didn't get from the fathers and the life of the church.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to go through all that church fathers, and I'm going to cherry pick and make a case, which is kind of what you do in academia already. It's not what you do in Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And thank God it took me 2 or 3 years to be humbled. And corrected by some very good scholars. There was presenting papers at some good Orthodox scholars. And I think just continually going through the suffering with my wife as well. I think that was a humbling process. Mm-hmm. And so I started losing faith in myself. And I think it's a good way to come into Orthodoxy. Think about a rehab program.
Yeah.
I've made a mess in my life. I really have. My life has become unmanageable, and I need help. Mm-hmm. We come in now, and the church will say, well, great, we've got a program for you that we can help you.
Yeah.
But the obstacle is if we come in, well, I already know these things and this is the way it should look, we're not going to experience that. And so one of the best ways to have that broken down is through pain and suffering. And so thank God for that. And then also some good, like I said, good people in my life. Now, what this allowed me to do, being immersed and just going to the services,
Mm-hmm.
I was continually praying, going to services, being immersed in the life of the church. I revisited the philosophy of science, the stuff that I had been learning about when I was in grad school.
Yeah.
And I was just looking for my philosophy of science book, and so I started realizing things. I started seeing things that I hadn't. It's up there. That I hadn't saw before.
Mm-hmm.
The deep problems in science is concerning knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And these various things. I revisited Thomas Kuhn, these various issues, and it clicked. I don't know what I was thinking when I read it in grad school, but it didn't click with me that what a precarious situation that science itself is in.
Yeah.
So it was deconstructed. I didn't realize I made an idol of science and I became a devotee of scientism. And it wasn't through putting on new lenses as Orthodox. When I revisited those works, I saw it in a new light. And I'm like, science can't get the knowledge.
Yeah.
It can't get to these. I mean, it says that it's, the highest form of knowledge. It can't even get over the problem of induction.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It can answer, right? So it doesn't even get the probabilistic knowledge.
Yeah.
I revisited Quine and all this different stuff, and I'm like, oh, this is a joke. Now, I still like science, right? But I put it in its proper context.
Exactly.
I think it was the deconstruction of the idol that I built
Mm-hmm.
that eventually allowed me. Well, that's why I believed in evolution, because I'm an enlightened man. You see,
Yeah.
I went to school and I got a PhD. I studied this stuff. Obviously, it must be true. But it's not until going back and going, this doesn't make any sense as far as like where I've elevated this on my priority list and hierarchy, and let alone in terms of knowledge. So I think it was kind of losing faith in the claims, the bold claims
Mm-hmm.
that
Yes.
those in scientism and often in science itself make, that allowed me to get out of theistic evolution too.
Mm-hmm.
And that coupled with the fact that I tried to argue my way around it, but ultimately it wasn't the spirit of the church. I was able to see when I was able to pick up and become keenly aware when I was forcing my way and interpretation on text versus being receptive of what the fathers and the church was saying. And what I realized is I couldn't get around the fact that evolution, theistic evolution, requires death before the fall.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that I had plenty of arguments to get around it, and it was the same. What's the word I use? Semantical sophistry and wizardry with words.
Yeah.
I always would be like, well, equivocate on this and jumping back and forth. Death really didn't mean death in this sense, right? A wordplay to get around what was obvious. It's exactly what the atheist does, right?
Yeah.
St. Paul says all men know God. They know it in their nous, but suppress it, the knowledge of God.
Yeah.
How do they do that? They build a system. They wordplay. They jump back and forth. Well, what if you consider this argument? What if I say this? And a whole bunch of ad hoc modifications to get around the obvious that's staring them straight in the face. God exists, and there's nothing more certain that you know. I felt that way with theistic evolution too.
Yeah.
It's not. But you really don't want it, do you? I'm like, no, I don't want it. And you've got enough schooling in you that you could wizard your way around these things using your words and arguments. Yeah, I could, huh?
Yeah.
And so I just gave up on that. I saw myself accurately, and that I was being dishonest, and this was not. I can intuit in my news. This was not the way of the fathers.
Yeah.
This is a forced interpretation that's just not there.
Yeah.
That's basically what happened.
Yeah. I had a very kind of similar experience. Like when I initially became Christian, I heard some like funny polemical arguments. I'm like, I just became like an agnostic on this issue. I'm like, oh, it doesn't really matter either way. It wasn't until in college I took a philosophy of science class, and you start reading Hume, you start reading the problem of induction, all of these different things in science that are just kind of assumed. And it was kind of, I like how you said losing faith in it, and I really lost faith in it, like to actually know with certainty that this is what happened. It's based on so many assumptions, and they extrapolate those assumptions, and it's just like that requires so much more faith. And it just, to me, I couldn't affirm that, and then also start to lose faith in the people who are promulgating this ideology. And so when I see the church fathers, it's very clear, is that's such an important, theological doctrine, that there is no death before the fall. Like if you have death before the fall, then
Death is natural.
Yeah.
I was talking to Father Russell up here about the same thing too, because he was even thinking about us having maybe Patricia Faith sponsoring an intelligent design conference up here.
Yeah.
Which would be cool.
Yeah. And
nothing set in stone, but like, we're brainstorming, new conferences to come. And I was like, and I know they're not Eric Meyer and William Dembski out of the Discovery Institute. They're not Orthodox, but like they're pretty good at the work that they do in intelligent design.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is I was getting frustrated being a professor. I got a job, I think in 2014, at the university teaching, and just seeing a lot of the liberal nonsense that had come in, and thinking about how it's just kind of manufactured.
Yes. Overton window.
The Overton window.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Total Overton window, right? What's allowed and what's not.
Yeah.
And being frustrated that the university was supposed to be this open university of ideas and debate. I'm like, clearly it's not.
Yeah.
And thinking about, gender studies departments and all these different things that are kind of, I started following the money and seeing how this stuff's kind of funded, and then seeing basically I have this, I even tweeted this today. I don't know.
Yes, totally. People don't acknowledge that, like, scientists aren't some like neutral, like no one's neutral. Everyone has a paradigm. Everyone, especially the money and the power structures, and how power structures, they promulgate certain ideas for certain reasons, and promoting the belief that we have common ancestor and death before the fall and everything. It promotes atheism and nihilism. And I think it makes the population more malleable, because they're like, well, nothing matters.
I mean, trace that back to the history of like Huxley and the funding.
Yes, exactly.
And where all that came from. And it started becoming obvious to me that I'm like, this is Antichrist.
Yes.
And this is a total joke, just by following the money.
Yeah.
And, I saw that with the climate change stuff, and I eventually worked the stuff into like the COOF stuff, COOF science. So I think it was multi-factor. Like there was a bunch of different stuff going on in my life that I kind of all coalesced to me like, oh, I don't believe this anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
I lost faith in this stupid facade and system.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean I'm anti-science.
Yeah.
I love science done in the correct way, and I can talk, hours for that. But anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And I think it does matter. I think that belief does matter, because we need, what you were saying a lot too, is like things in its proper context. Like, philosophy is really good. That's my next question is, why should we study logic and philosophy, because it is really important. Like, yes, we need to live orthodoxy, but philosophy isn't evil. Philosophy alone doesn't save us, but philosophy is like the pursuit of truth, and it's like in its proper context, it's a very good thing.
Yeah, and if we take it back to the kind of original notion too, so philosophia in the etymology, the love of wisdom. So it's not just episteme, um, scientia in the Latin. Uh, it's a wisdom, and we know that with wisdom, wisdom is not getting more facts in your head, but there's the acquisition of virtue
Yeah.
with this, and so you certainly see this in Plato, that this kind of synergy, but to see things. So he's got a virtue epistemology, is what I'm trying to say,
Yes.
and so does Aristotle. That to see truth, one has to acquire virtue, and by acquiring virtues, one begins to see more truth, and that it's a therapia, that it's a spiritual conversion,
Yeah.
done in the correct way. So these things, unfortunately, this becomes divorced from the good
Yeah.
life, right, and acquiring the virtues, and becomes kind of an abstractionism and just intellectual exercise that leads its way into scholasticism and modernity, etc. But we can think about, of course, we Christians believe in that original kind of sense of the love of wisdom, who the teacher is Christ,
Yes.
the light of men, who came into the darkness, right, to enlighten and to what? Not just give us facts,
Yeah.
but to help us acquire virtues that we may become more godlike, because all the virtues, spiritual virtues, are possessed by Christ. So he provides a way to that. And in that sense, that's philosophy. Philosophy is also, I'm bringing this up because I saw some guy in my chat, not chat, but in the YouTube comments.
Yeah.
By the way, you have the craziest people getting your YouTube comments, like hands down. Like, I don't know how you get the people that you do. So I feel very fortunate and privileged that I only get a fraction of that madness.
Yeah.
But some guy was saying that philosophy has no universal agreed upon definition and has no rigor or methodology or something like that. Well, first of all, he's comparing it to science.
Yeah.
They have different ends.
Yes.
Right? Science requires, at a particular point in time, a certain level of consensus. Why? Because it's a praxis.
Yeah.
It's applied knowledge. And so if everybody's arguing about how many elements are in the periodic chart, and whether there's electrons, strong versus weak forces and stuff like that, nobody's going to get anything done. So it's got a different kind of task.
Yeah.
So philosophy doesn't require universal consensus. In fact, it thrives when there's not. Why? Because it's aimed at something different. But I would say that whether people recognize it or not, it seems to be, whether maybe this is a working definition, it's the science or discipline of thinking correctly about any particular subject, as any subject matter. It's not restricted to just thinking about physical things, or craftsmanship or something like that, or numbers. It can think about anything. And so that's why we can say, well, what's your philosophy on this? What's your philosophy on life? In some sense, it just becomes synonymous with thinking. That's why it doesn't make sense when somebody says philosophy's defunct discipline. Oh, great philosophy. You never get out of the philosophy box, right? There's some people that are better at it than others. So in a general kind of definitionary sense, whether I don't need a consensus to get to that, but the fact is that's the way that it operates in all throughout history and departments as well, is that we study some of the best thinkers in Western civilization, um, critically. We study the kind of foundational tools of logic, philosophy, which would be logic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rules of thoughts, how to distinguish good arguments from bad arguments. Why? Because it's a training program in thinking deeply, critically,
Yeah.
sharply, um, and being able to make distinctions that can universally be applicable to any discipline that you go in. And so God's given us a mind.
Yeah.
And so it's a gift. Now, maybe not everybody's called to it at the same level.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, not everybody's called to sign up for a philosophy course.
Yeah.
But if you do want to contact me, um, to refine the mind, that we're told about the parable of the talents. Like, what are we doing with it? Are we burying it?
Yeah.
Are we wasting our mind, or are we making something more of it? And then Eucharistically in Thanksgiving, giving back the thank you to God
Yeah.
by saying, I invested in the gift that you gave me, and I made it more. And again, I always see that in conjunction with the virtues. And
Yes.
furthermore, too, not everybody's called to apologetics and defending the faith. St. Paul talks about it, to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that we have within us.
Yeah.
And that the fact of the matter is that it requires us studying and learning and refining our thinking skills, our argumentative skills, the ability to distinguish good and bad arguments, so that we can refute heretics and heresies that are diseases that will corrupt the faithful.
Yeah.
So philosophy is excellent at that. Study Western thought critically, learn where they're mistaken, and just going through that makes you a better thinker that can be applied to not only everything in your life, but certainly our faith. I think that I can spot it. I can spot when something's a bad argument.
Yeah.
Take St. Paul also says, we demolish arguments
Yeah.
that set itself up against the kingdom of God, and we take every thought and make it captive and obedient to Christ. How do you think you do that? You refine your thinking.
Yeah.
You use arguments.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think that's very beneficial. I know people have asked me, they'll see Jay or myself who've been doing this forever. So for me to be Orthodox, do I have to learn philosophy and apologetics? No. When you go into a church, don't you see the people baking and doing coffee hour? You see the choir people. I mean, wouldn't it be strange to be like, oh man, do I have to learn how to bake to become Orthodox? Like, no, like there's a talent.
Yeah.
There's different parts of the body, and if it's your thing, if you're good at it, and God blesses you, take up that talent and make it more. That's it. One of the talents is that people might be more intellectually inclined and like to study things very deeply, be critical, form arguments, and stuff like that. It can be a great benefit under the guidance in the right, like you said, in the right place, right? That that it's not just this abstract intellectual exercise, but you're plugged into a real community, a face-to-face encounter with your family, which is your parish, under your priest, while you're acquiring the virtues. With the blessing, it can be done well.
Yeah. What I love so much is listening to you and Jay talk, because I've never heard like people approach apologetics in this way, and it was just so sound to hear. I didn't know what epistemology was. Like, I've heard a little bit about metaphysics. Most people know about ethics, but the way that you guys talk about how they all work together, it's you're arguing at the paradigm level. These are really a web of beliefs that are all interconnected. I've never heard any, like, seeing your critiques of the atheist reviews is just like, wow, you're not going to get this anywhere else. And it's addicting to keep learning more and more. And then also to hear I think the strongest form of argument for God, the transcendental argument for God, which you guys have done, many streams on. The strongest form of argument, the impossibility of the contrary. If you want to explain that a little for maybe people who don't know about that.
So what's interesting too is just going back full circle to kind of my conversion story, how God uses things in your life. Nothing God does or allows is superfluous.
Mm-hmm.
That's why when the devil on the Mount Temptation tempts Christ to turn the stones into bread, and I've seen atheists do this too. If God real, then come down and do a miracle. Guess what? Only fools and devils ask for superfluous miracles.
Yeah.
Nothing God does is superfluous. He's not going to come down to the dock and entertain you like a circus clown.
Yeah.
Only fools request something like that, or the demons.
Yeah.
So now think back on your life then. Everything was in its right place. God allowed it, right? What men intended for evil, God intends for good. Even He doesn't want you to do bad things, but He'll work good out of that. So there's nothing that's superfluously placed in your life. All is working towards that. And I was thinking about the fact of the matter is that, when I was 18, 17 years old, I was introduced to Russ Manning and some of these guys. They introduced me to the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Another group was Bob and Gretchen Passantino. And I learned that. There was, since I was 18, I'm 46 now. And there was times I pushed away from it, particularly when I got in to become more of an Aristotelian Thomistic. Mm-hmm. Why? Because I embraced natural theology, and they were mutually incompatible. Mm-hmm. But I eventually once I deconstructed the natural theology and Thomism by being an Orthodoxy, I realized that, look, it's pretty simple. We just make everything complicated. What could possibly be, as a Christian, think about this. How would you answer it? What possibly could be a standard independent and higher than God by which you judge and prove God by? How blasphemous is that?
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing independent. There's nothing that stands behind God that you prove Him by.
Yeah.
He is the standard for all things. He is the starting point.
Yeah.
Both epistemically and metaphysically. So it doesn't make sense, and it's blasphemous to construct an arbitrary system mm-hmm. that God has to fit in, and I have to prove Him by. It's like, no, He is the proof for proofs. He's the reason for reason. You've got it backwards. And don't we always do that? We invert that. And so that's been kind of my task too, is to show that when we construct a system, an epistemology or metaphysics, we're idolatrous, and that those systems fall apart. Once we analyze them, they don't do the work that they promise, right? It's sorcery.
Yeah.
An illusion and sorcery presents to you a certain reality that isn't real. Mm-hmm. This is what these philosophical systems do. Look what we can do. We can know all these systems. No, you can't.
Yeah.
Why? Because you're either arbitrarily just asserting it. What do I always say? Well, just grant me all my presuppositions without justifying, so I can justify my system. Mm-hmm. Or it's axiomatic. I just assert it's either viciously circular, so it doesn't do the work that you want it to do. Mm-hmm. It's true if it's true. Let's just assume it's true.
Yeah.
Or I just assert it's axiomatic. It's just, and so again, part of the problem is because we're finite. We can't do these things. We cannot construct an autonomous epistemology in metaphysics. Psalm says, God is the Lord who has revealed Himself to us, not who we've deduced through a cosmological argument from some stupid philosophy system that I built in my head, that I just made up, that I can't justify. Correct? So that's basically the kind of transcendental argument, it's the gospel. It's not really an argument. It's to break down all the other arguments. Everything that sets itself up against Christ and the kingdom of God, right? All these systems are setting themselves up against the kingdom of God. As an apologist, we tear down the strongholds. We demolish every argument. So there's nothing left than Christ. There's no other excuse. And that's why I put it in the dichotomy. You only have two ways to go, brothers and sisters. You have either a purposeful creator that's personal, that's behind everything in the universe, or the negation of that. What's the negation of purpose? Accident. I bring up that if I drive my wall into the car, that's my new album. Check it out. My new LP is coming out. Driving your walls into cars
with Chase Hacker.
And talking to your drugs about kids. It will be the second album. So if I drive my car into the wall, it's on purpose. The disjunction of that would be accident. Oh, he drove it in on an accident. So those are your two principles. Ultimately, we'll dial back to that. There's no third option in that. It's either purposeful intention or accidentalism. If you do not accept that God is the starting point, that there's a personal being behind all the arguments, that he is the reason for reason, then you start with accident. At that point, in an accidental world, there is no rationality. There's no arguments. There's no arguments for arguments. All of it's an oxymoron. The accidental laws of physics, laws preclude accident. Accidental knowledge precludes. You can't actually then critique the position. Be like, well, I don't think your argument worked. So what are we doing there? We're granting them pretended autonomy. And they keep wanting to do that. Well, I don't think it's a good argument. And it doesn't fulfill the modal condition for what are you talking about? There are no modal conditions. There's no sequiturs. There's nothing in accidentalism. So I'm just going to ignore that and give it to you so that you can, again, what does it come down to? Just grant me my unjustifiable in principle of accidentalism actually can produce rationality, and it can have this rational worth. So I can actually make an argument against you. It's like, no, I won't. So that's part of the presuppositional apologetics, is you don't grant them anything. And they'll keep going there. You just be like, you're not in a position to say anything meaningful or make any knowledge claims in accidentalism. And you just got to keep doing it, right? So what you're really doing is you're tearing down the strongholds so they can just see the gospel. God is the Lord who revealed himself. Say it. Christ is Lord.
Christ is Lord.
Say it. Christ is Lord.
That's really what it comes down to. I mean, you can't really know you can't have a justified true belief in anything, because eventually on an atheistic worldview, you're having an arbitrary starting point. Like logic itself, if everything's accidental, so logic, it's a defeater for knowledge.
It's a total defeater for, and I think that's a simple way. I mean, the thing that you're going to see is it becomes immediately obvious is it isn't about arguments. The atheist is like, well, if I just had a solid enough argument, if I just had evidence. No. In fact, I came up with this argument when I was an undergraduate. I just taught it last week. I took Pascal's wager, and I don't think Pascal's making an argument for the existence of God, because he's he's not a rationalist. Descartes' a rationalist. He's his contemporary, right? And he's critiquing Descartes. He actually even says to Descartes, I think in a letter, like, you never talk about God. use them for like your
Yeah.
second meditation, and then you throw them out and never.
Exactly.
I got. I'm done with you. I used you for my philosophical system. Now you're
Yeah.
out. Blaise Pascal is much more orthodox in his kind of approach. So we have to understand that the wager is not an argument for the existence of God.
Mm-hmm.
What Pascal's doing in there is he's illustrating there's a distinction between the intellect and the will. How does he do this? In other words, you can present an argument to the mind. The will can always choose not to believe it.
Exactly.
And what I did is I illustrated this by taking the argument and taking all the terms God and the infinite gain versus infinite loss out, and I just turned it into a roulette game of black and white. Mm-hmm. Took the whole, and everybody always chooses red. Now, red is belief in God. Mm-hmm. So once you take the term God out, it reveals that the mind understands the argument, and then somebody wills not to actually believe it.
Yeah.
And you'll start to notice this it isn't about the argument. So there's no argument that's going to convince somebody that doesn't want, hence the will, to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a sick will. It's not a sick mind.
Mm-hmm.
Your mind is the problem.
Yeah.
And so what do? Take away the excuses. Tear down the strongholds. Mm-hmm. Show them you're not in a position to make any claims. Yeah. So that hopefully by the grace of God and the power of the gospel and the church, they can begin to be, see themselves that, like, what did I say in the beginning? I've made a mess of my life and I don't know what I'm talking about. Amen. What a great place to be. We've got a program for you and can help you.
Yeah.
And now you can get better. Mm-hmm. That's all we want to do. So the transcendental argument's the gospel. It's not an argument. It's the gospel.
Exactly. I don't know if this is the best example, but one thing I talk about is a lot of atheists, they love science so much, and like it shows that there's, benefits to that, like, eating healthy and working out. But, so then why would, like, if a person is all logical and it's all about arguments, then why are there, like, atheists who are overweight? Because what is that symptom of? Is it symptom of a logical problem? No, because
that's a good point.
Because they logically know that it's that they should work out, they should eat healthy. So why don't they do it? It's because they struggle with the spiritual problem of gluttony, and we all have our sins like that. It's like, I don't need to show they can even know something is true, and yet they're still not going to follow it because there's other things at play, the spiritual problem.
How many times have you heard this? I even had like a family member, not close family member, but somebody bring this up. But it's a typical liberal talking point that, you know what the problem with all these inner cities and crime and different stuff and third world countries, they're just not educated enough. You see, all the world's problems can be solved by education. Because when it really boils down to it, the problems in man's life are simply that they just don't have enough facts in their head. You see, I mean, how absurd is this? And I said, have you not heard of the evil genius? I'm sure he has plenty of facts in his head. It didn't make him better, right? It doesn't, and again, what are you going to send him to? Brainwashing elite-funded institutions and universities that are totally corrupt brainwashing machines? Okay, now you got a bunch of facts in your heads, right? It's not knowledge. You've got, I should put it this way, you have a bunch of information in your head. It's not knowledge. And this is really kind of when the internet was rolled out, was the same kind of deception. Oh, wow, we're going to have this new revolution in human consciousness. You see, the next phase of why? Because we've got the information highway. Well, the internet didn't provide us knowledge. It provided us a bunch of information, and mainly bad. Not even to bring up the whole thing that it's like manufactured consent of how you can actually manufacture people to believe pretty much anything you want through this thing. I feel it's the same way too. And all of it's just to illustrate it's not about
Yeah.
Man's problems are not about information, and I just need more facts in my head.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I think this is a great place to end it. I definitely want to do a part 2 because I've got a lot more questions and things I want to ask. But this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Continue the good work, and
Thank
God
you.
bless.
God bless.